Hello, I'm Ariel Frame, and today I'm quite curious to speak with James Marshall. James, how you doing?
Good, thanks. How are you doing, Ariel?
I'm doing great. James, you're a professor here at University of Sheffield. Please tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do.
That's correct. So I'm a professor in computer science, and I'm the director of the Centre for Machine Intelligence, which is the AI research centre at the university. But I'm also a kind of biologist and neuroscientist-oriented person. So I do computational biology. And I'm also the co-founder and the founder science officer of a university spin-out called Opteran Technologies, which tries to take some of the research I did and deploy it in robots in the real world.
Excellent, cool. I mean, a lot of interests there, intersecting interests, and I saw how all these interests play out when I read your recent papers, should I say, sister papers in eLife. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to do this work?
Yeah, sure. So I've been running a lab in the university for a long time that looks at insects, brains and behavior and neuroscience and how those things all tie together. And ran a couple of projects. And I guess the journey really started for me around 2010, shortly before, when there was a really big focus in the neuroscience community on understanding the human brain. And there was the use of supercomputers to model bits of starting with other vertebrate brains like the mouse brain and bits of cat brain and stuff, and then with an ambition to scale up to the human brain. And I was thinking, why the heck are we starting with the human brain? And even vertebrate brains, like even a mouse brain, is pretty big and complex, and we don't understand it very well when we haven't started even looking at some of the simpler brains on the planet, which are still really behaviorally interesting, like insect brains. So I proposed a research project and assembled a team of experts around, let's try and understand more of how the insect brain really works and what we can learn about that for AI and robotics.
You know, that really resonates with me because my interest originally, my journey of science was, why are people the way they are? How are they able to think the way they are? But then, when you, in the light of the existence of evolution, you think, okay, well, I mean, these other organisms on the planet function similarly, and anything you learn about another animal might actually tell you something about how humans function as well. So then you can actually do like controlled experiments that you couldn't or wouldn't want to even do with humans. So I really understand how you would go down that path and want to go to insects. So in these sister papers in eLife, you're working on bee behavior. Can you tell us a little bit about why bees?
So bees are really interesting because their brains are kind of at the right size, the right sweet spot. They're just big enough to generate interesting behavior. And their lifestyle as well, because they're social insects, they live in colonies. That means they need to be really good at behaviors, especially navigation behaviors, because they need to fly out into the world, find things like food, resources, come back and tell other bees in the colony where to find those things. And, if the bee flies out, finds some flowers or something and fails to get back, then that bee's gone and the colony's got no energy intake from that bee. So it's a wasted journey and a waste of a bee. So that makes them, they've had this, you mentioned evolution, they've had this really strong selective pressure to be very good at visual navigation. And I think that's why I was really attracted to them in the first place. But also their brains are just big enough that they actually have enough kind of plasticity, flexibility in their brains to be able to learn things that they've never really been presented with in their kind of natural lifestyle. And some papers that really inspired me back at the turn of this millennium were some research demonstrating that apparently honeybees can learn concepts like sameness and difference. And this is a kind of complex form of learning that typically people have assumed only humans can do, and maybe some other great apes or what have you. But for a brain of 1 million neurons, a honeybee brain of only 1 million neurons to be able to do that seemed pretty extraordinary. So it seemed like it was definitely worth working out how can such a small brain do that.
I think for most people who don't really think about bees all that much, when they do think about bees, they might think like the old style thoughts of these are kind of like automata. They can't be really thinking anything. And it's actually quite phenomenal to find out what insects are capable of, specifically bees. I mean, bees are quite cool. People like them. I was just in Manchester. It's their like logo on everything. So everybody likes bees.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
not everybody knows what bees can do. So what did you find that bees could do in this paper or in these sister papers, and how did you show how they do it?
So we started off, I mean, a lot of people have looked at how bees can learn things. So you can train bees to associate patterns with rewards. Like they really like sugar solution. They really dislike quinine, which is the bitter herb you get in, I think it's tonic, right, in the gin and tonic. They really find that very unpleasant. So you can do what's called conditioning. You can train them to associate a particular stimulus, like a color or a pattern or something like that, or even a particular human face, with a reward or with a punishment over time. But then it's really interesting to figure out how do they actually solve that problem, because the way they sense the world, they fly around, and they're sensing the world by flying around. So what we did was, in the first paper, we videotaped, it was actually bumblebees, not honeybees, but we videotaped them while they were learning these tasks to associate stimulus with reward or punishment, and then analyzed using AI techniques and statistics and etc. What are the flight patterns? What information could they be extracting? What information do they pay attention to when they're actually doing all of this? So that was the first paper, and we found some very stereotypical patterns, some very typical patterns of behavior. And then we built a model of that, a simple, abstraction of bits of the honeybee brain involved in the visual processing and the learning that showed how their brain circuits could actually be implementing that behavior.
That's excellent. I mean, now, we were saying some people don't think about bees. They don't look at them that closely. You looked really closely. You had a special camera to look exactly where they were going. And, they're flying at images, I suppose. You're giving them images and they're landing near or far from them, and they care to go to it because you're motivating them with good tasting things or bad tasting things.
Absolutely. So the experiment was set up. We printed out different patterns. They were primarily crosses that were either kind of oriented vertically or at 45 degrees, so like an X or a plus sign. And there would be a little kind of receptacle in the center of the pattern that they would fly to, and it would either have the sugar reward in or it would have the quinine punishment in. And they would learn, for example, one experiment might be plus is sugar and cross is quinine, is bitter. But then we used one or sometimes several cameras, very high speed cameras, up to like 240 frames per second, to get really detailed recordings of how they were flying around in 3D space. And from that, you can figure out, what they can actually see. You can figure out which bits of the pattern are important to them, given the approach they make, the kind of flight path they make to approach and inspect the pattern. And we discovered some very stereotypical patterns, as I say.
So you looked into the eyes of these bees and said, where are you looking when you're going to these sweet or bitter tastes? And where did they look?
Well, you can pretty much look through their eyes. In fact, you can even make a little computer simulation of what they would be able to see, because, they can't, their eyes are just fixed, the compound eye is just kind of looking out at the world all the time. So you don't really have to use an eye tracker like you would with a human, or you can just look at how's the bee's body oriented and the head oriented, and you can reconstruct actually what they could see. And what we found was that the information they really paid most attention to was always the bottom half of the pattern. So their flight patterns and what they could see during those flight patterns, the bottom halves of the patterns were most informative for them. That's what they paid attention to. And we found that out by doing some tests where we would cut away some of the information. So we'd either cut away the top half of the pattern or the bottom half of the pattern. And we found that if you cut away the top half of the pattern, they could still recognize the half of the cross or the half of the plus that was left and make the correct choice. But if you cut away the bottom half, then they basically became like random. They started guessing. They didn't have enough information anymore.
That's wild. I mean, why do you think they do that?
I'm not really sure why they do it. There's in the evolution of behavior, there's this whole thing of, is it actually adaptive? Does it give an advantage, or is it just a consequence of something else? And it might just be a consequence of, some of their flight dynamics, aerial, what's the word for it? Airflows, all that kind of stuff, the efficiency of the flight pattern in approaching a surface or something like that. There might be something else which is not to do with the visual information, but is important to the bee that actually guides that. But in the end, all of these things co-evolve, flight behaviors, efficiency, and visual learning, they all co-evolve. So at the end, what you get is like a system that you can look at and go, how does it work? And that's just how it works.
You'd mentioned that you developed a model. I think this isn't like a diorama, like a physical thing that you built, but something on the computer.
Yeah.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's a computational model. So the second of the sister papers is a model that explains how bits of the bee brain could be processing what the bee can see in order to generate the behavior that we see, the learning behavior that we see. And so it's a computational model. It's a kind of neural network. Neural networks are very well known now because they're the root of deep learning, which is AI that everyone is using now in the GPTs and in deep networks that are recognizing your voice on your phone or something like that. But these are much simpler neural networks that are much closer to the actual biology. So they're trying to capture the key features of how everything goes from what are called the photoreceptors, so the bits of the eye, the bits of the bee eye that receive light and kind of go, yeah, right, I've seen some light there. Feeding it through kind of what's called the early visual processing system. So there's a few layers in the brain, different well-defined brain regions that process the visual information and kind of refine it to make it more usable further down into the brain. And then there's a kind of memory center in the bee as well, and in other insects called the mushroom body, which is where they form memories and they learn to associate stimulus with reward, for example. And so those cells, those neurons in the mushroom body are also modeled. They get input from the visual system, and effectively at the end, that all gets condensed down into yes, I like this pattern, or no, I don't like this pattern, according to what the training has been, according to whether it was paired with the reward or the stimulus. So we give our virtual bee brains, the visual information, but we also give them then the kind of virtual sugar or the virtual quinine, the virtual bitter taste. And they progressively learn to, associate the pattern with the reward.
I mean, that's awesome that you can, program something to do what bees do. What did you find was the extent to which your model could do what bees could do?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. We found that the simulated bee brains could do exactly what the real bees could do. So the first paper we had with the crosses and the pluses, we could get the kind of same patterns of choice out there and the same patterns that I mentioned. Like if you cut away the top half of the pattern, then the bee could still choose, and the bottom half it couldn't choose properly. Well, the simulated bees did the same thing. And then we also applied the same model to some other classic experiments people have done with bees, such as discriminating, recognizing individual human faces. So you can give a bee a picture of you, for example, and a picture of me, and we could say that Ariel gives you the sugar reward and James gives you the bitter quinine, and the bee can learn that successfully. And again, our simulated bee brains were able to learn the faces. So even though the model hadn't been designed to do that, in fact, it wasn't even designed to do the crosses versus the pluses at all, which is a really interesting departure that we should come to actually about how brains differ from AI and why efficiency is so important.
Yes, please do
as well. So, like if you were using an AI to solve this problem, what you might do is show it lots of crosses and lots of pluses, and say, right, here's the reward, here's not the reward, and eventually you'd have an AI, a deep network that could do that. And that would happen pretty quickly in that particular example, because that's a simple problem, crosses versus pluses. But what the real brain does is actually use what's called non-associative learning. So the early visual system that I described, all these layers that go through from the photoreceptors, where the light lands on the eye, captures the light and then progressively refines it, is actually learning how the world works. So in our model, we showed our simulated bees sequences of natural images of flowers separated over time, just the way as the bee would see different views of the flower over time as it flew around it. We gave our simulated bee brain, the early visual system, these different bits of the flower image over time that were kind of slightly different views, as if the bee was scanning around. And there was no reward associated with that. So this is what's called non-associative learning. The neurons in that part of the brain just learned to discriminate what was useful. It's a kind of way of extracting meaning from data. So that meant those early visual neurons became better and better at just recognizing the things that make up bits of flowers, like edges with different orientations and all kinds of stuff that you can use to recognize the bits of flowers. So that's how the bee brain was kind of how it developed. And then we tested it with the crosses and pluses, which are not flowers at all. And what it learned from the flowers was a good enough way of representing the world visually that it could solve these visual learning problems that are quite unrelated.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we're like taking what you would actually learn from the world, from real world, I guess, natural world, giving that information to the model or the bee in either way, and then saying, okay, well, how can I repurpose that information in any case, and then applying it in many different circumstances.
Yeah.
And it kind of feels like when you're describing different aspects of the model or different parts of the brain of the bee brain, that they're each kind of doing some sort of computation or learning in of themselves. Is that kind of like, are they like separate little modules, I guess?
Yeah. So if you look at a bee brain, a scan of a bee brain, or any insect brain, it's very modular. You have well-defined different regions that have different functions, and it's a bit more complex than this region only does that thing. The brain's complicated. We're still trying to work it out, and there can be multiple functions for a particular brain region, but we still have good understandings of some functions that the different modules have. So it is, I'm a computer scientist and an engineer by training, and so it does look, very much like an engineered system. In engineering and computer science, you're trained to kind of divide and conquer, break the problem down into smaller sub-problems and solve those. And software engineering is very much about making software modules that plug together. So brains kind of look very much like engineered things, which is great because then we can use engineering principles as well to try and figure out actually how they're put together and how they do what they're doing.
That's amazing. And then once we determine what brains do or how they seem to be engineered, can we then learn something from those brains to then go back and engineer things in the real world?
Absolutely. So, I mean, this is actually what I've been doing with my commercialization, with my spin-out Opteran. So when I started looking at brains, I said that I was responding to a real kind of human fixation that neuroscience had on understanding the big brains, the big sexy brains on the planet. But at the same time, the deep learning revolution was taking off. So this was around 2010, 2012. And that's when image classification really took off and became what's called human competitive in that environment. And that just that kicked off the world we're now living in. But I was looking also at deep networks, deep neural networks, and thinking that's really not how the brain works. And you can tell that it's not, because although they can get good at recognizing images, for example, or your voice, or generating text now, or videos or whatever, the way they do that is hugely inefficient. It's so inefficient compared to how the brain does it. So you need vast amounts of data, which is what the internet provides. You need vast compute servers to run algorithms on the huge amounts of data. And so it makes it very expensive in terms of money, in terms of energy costs and other resources. So I was very much motivated to try and work out more of how the brain truly works, to understand its efficiency secrets and its robustness secrets as well, because modern AI is also pretty fragile, and turn that into technology. And so I kind of had these two goals, one scientific and one engineering, running in parallel through all of my research. So with Opteran, we finally started cashing that out 5 years ago and developing a kind of neural network, if you like, which is very different to a modern AI. It's not really trained in the same way. It's much more based on reverse engineering how a real brain works to solve problems like visual navigation, which is that's the most fundamental problem for a robot, right? Is how to move around in space. And and we've been pretty successful, and and we think there's a lot more to do there as well, right? We've really barely scratched the surface, we think, of the secrets of the brain and what we can learn from it for human technology.
So I guess what am I picturing this being applied to? My brain immediately goes to, like, I guess, robots and how we might use them. I've never been to an Amazon factory, but I imagine nowadays it's probably a bunch of robots running around putting packages here and there. And I don't know if people are like automatically flying things through the air as well. So you have a perfect analogy to like a bee. But is that the type of thing? Like what actually would you use these sort of visual navigation capabilities for?
Well, yeah, you can use it for pretty much anything. So Optran started off doing drones early because, in fact, we started off doing that in the research project because flying robots, as you say, makes sense in the context of looking at flying insects. But there's not really a big demand for drones. They're a cool technology, but their applications are a little bit limited. It's not like there's a huge amount of economic value you could go after there as a spin out, and spin outs need to make money, right? They can't just do cool stuff. They need to have lots of customers to pay enough to have a viable business. Otherwise, no one invests.
Fair enough.
So you mentioned warehouse logistics. That's actually where Opteran is focused. Its subsequent attention, because there's lots and lots of warehouse robots, and the way they currently work is really expensive. Like the compute requirements for them, the sensors are all very expensive. They're pretty big, heavy, big power consumption, which means you need big batteries, and then you get in a kind of vicious cycle. So you end up with these very large, very expensive robots, and then quite often you also need lots of infrastructure as well. So, you have to maybe put some QR codes up or something to help the robots figure out which aisle they're on. And or maybe tapes on the ground, like magnetic tapes on the ground that they can follow. And that, again, makes it really expensive to deploy because, you want to bring robots into your warehouse, then you have to make it robot friendly.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, of course, people will just work anywhere. The brain is so flexible and good at representing space and figuring out how to get around space that you don't need to do all of that stuff for humans, for human workers. So, what Opteran offers is a kind of much more efficient approach, much cheaper approach to deploy right now to warehouse robotics as their kind of first market, what's called a beachhead market in commercial spaces.
So, with all these technologies like the ones that you're developing, what's your prediction? Could you make any predictions on like any changes or fundamental changes in how we might use robots, I guess, in the future?
Well, I think it's more about how we build the robots and how we build the brains. So deep networks, current AI is it's drawn some inspiration from the brain, but it's the inspiration it drew from the brain is like a 40-year-old kind of cartoon of the brain, really.
Yeah.
And there's much more richness there, which is where the neuroscience is so valuable. So I think future AI will not be based on deep learning. Deep learning will be part of the solution, and GPTs, so the generative AI technologies will be part of the solution, but a small part of the solution, because there's a lot of other stuff that sits below the bits of the brain that inspired those approaches that has been almost completely ignored by current technologies. So I think there'll be a new approach, and it will be based on a much more faithful understanding of how the brain solves the autonomy problem, starting with the lowest level, with the visual processing and visual learning, like we're modeling with the bees, for example, and then building more and more complexity on top of that. Whereas the current approach, if you look at ChatGPT, for example, is to try and solve everything using this one approach and treat it as a silver bullet. That, deep learning and transformers, which is the evolution that led to ChatGPT, that alone, plus lots of data, plus lots of compute, is somehow sufficient to solve autonomy and intelligence. And, I'm not alone in thinking this. So prominent people like Jan LeCun, who's Meta's chief AI scientist, so the people behind Facebook, they also think that we need to rethink it completely, that there needs to be a new approach based more on cognitive psychology and neuroscience. And there's also been, I think, some kind of an increasing realization as well that take generative AI, for example, the fact that we can't get away from hallucinations and all these other kinds of things indicates that actually that will not be the final, the end point in the quest for intelligence, for artificial intelligence.
So if I'm understanding correctly, if you go back to your fundamental neuroscience understanding and take into account our new understanding and not just some of the first things we found out, and then maybe look at each problem and break it down into different parts. Maybe we do these modules like you said you're doing in this visual task example. Then in the future, each each instance where you're going to have something you might call an AI functioning, it'll be like more seamless and less likely to have some of these problems that are popping up where people are using, I guess, single approaches to program their AI, and it's failing in kind of ways maybe we didn't expect. I don't know if people did expect this.
I think actually the surprise for AI was that it worked as well as it did. That you could take an 40-year-old idea. So deep networks were proposed in the 1980s fundamentally. And if you just got enough data from the internet and enough compute servers, then it would actually start doing useful stuff. And that was actually surprising, I think. People had been ignoring the approach for a long time until the internet enabled the scale required for the technology to work. And I think people are genuinely surprised, actually. So, now it's 2025. ChatGPT is launched, 3 years ago. The actual research behind that is only 8 years old. The first research paper from Google that described the GPT, this transformer approach, is only 8 years old. So, and now we've already got these kind of conversational agents that can do coding, that can generate videos, images, all kinds of stuff. And again, I think people are actually surprised that it's a pretty simple technology, and what makes it work is just huge amounts of data and compute. And I think actually everyone is a bit surprised that it works as well as it does. But it's already reaching demonstrable limits. So we had just had the launch of GPT-5, which was the latest version of OpenAI's big model, and it was pretty underwhelming. It had been hyped for a long time, and I think it failed to live up to expectations because people are starting to realize actually there must be more to intelligence than just this big kind of soup of lots of neurons talking to each other in a completely unstructured way and just forcing lots of data through it to make it behave intelligently. The brain does something much, much more elegant.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if what we thought was amazing was really actually based on something quite simple, then really there's actually a lot more room to grow.
Yeah, absolutely.
And technology advances very, very, very fast, and people talk about how it's like exponentially growing. I mean, it's hard to imagine actually kind of what's next. I think maybe you're in the best position to make some of those predictions, I guess. But if you're, looking at these bees or any other insects and their behavior and working in your lab, what kind of research would you imagine you're going to be doing in the future to tackle these problems you're talking about?
Well, if I took a step to a level up, I would actually look at what do I think, where should we be putting our resources as a society? Because at the moment, so there are these huge plans for data centers to run generative AI and what have you, and that's an awful lot of money, energy, water, all kinds of resource being put into this idea. I would put a smaller amount of resource into funding more basic research in neuroscience and animal behavior. Not just bees, I mean, fruit flies as well, very interesting, a bit simpler, but with lots of really useful lab tools that enable us to tease apart the brain. And then the mice and the cats and the rats and the primates and what have you, and the human neuroscience. Because I think if we put like a fraction of our resources that are currently going into AI deployment into building a more genuine and deep understanding of how the brain generates its behavior, we would have just a treasure trove of things to learn from, algorithms to extract, that would really pay off in terms of, future autonomy, robots that are efficient and robust and cheap to deploy and don't cost the earth fundamentally.
Well, I mean, that sounds like excellent advice. I think I would endorse the same message as well. Doing basic science and trying to make the case that there's some applicability to it down the road. In your case, not that far down the road, actually, quite directly down the road. But yeah, it's really awesome to hear about your new work. And I would encourage people to go read both these sister eLife papers. They're going to be linked to in the description. And excited for all the studies you're going to be doing. If people wanted to find out more about you or your research, is there somewhere on the internet they can find you?
They can look up the old research project at brainsonboard.co.uk, which is pretty old, but it shows some of what we did and the team we pulled together and some of the papers that we published back in the day. And then you can look at opteran.com for the kind of commercialization view of things. So yeah, that gives a bit of a snapshot of where the research came from and where it can be going in the real world.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on Quite Curious. I've been your host, Ariel Frame, and we've been speaking with James Marshall.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks.